And hello there.
Hello!
You know, we're coming up on St. Patrick's Day. And so there's a couple of things you should know. One is, what is a shillelagh? And as he said, it's a blackthorn. Usually, a shillelagh is made from the root of a blackthorn tree, a piece of the root. Or it's made from a branch at times. Either way, as a root, you have all these little bumps on there, which are little shoots going off of the root into the soil to soak up moisture. And the way it turns black, other than the handle, is that in the old days, they used to take lard or bacon grease and oil, different oils, and they would coat the root and let it sit by the side of the hearth, by the fireplace, and they would pour ashes, soot, over the oil on the root and let it sit and cure in the heat of the fireplace. And sometimes it would sit there for a month. And when it was done, they would take it out, and it would have a permanent black coating that had soaked into the very wood itself. And the whole purpose of a shillelagh was, one, yes, it makes a great walking stick. But in the old days, and sometimes now today, when Irish boys reached the age of about 7, they would be given a shillelagh because it was a defensive mechanism, much like you tend to think of as being a Japanese martial art. But it was an Irish martial art. And it was known by every Irishman because it was traditional, part of the rite of passage for a father or an uncle to teach his son or nephew how to use a shillelagh to defend themselves. An integral part of the culture. So when you see those movies where an Irishman is walking down a road with his shillelagh, it has a lot more purpose than being something to lean on. It protects it from everyone around. Now, there are things other than that you should know about St. Patrick's Day. For instance, St. Patrick, was not Irish. He was a Welshman. And when he was about 16 years old, he was living on the Atlantic coast of Britain, of Wales, actually. And he was the son of a very wealthy couple, a very wealthy Roman occupation era family. And the pirates would come in from over in Ireland, and they would raid the coastal towns, and they would capture people, and they would take them into slavery. And Patrick was one of those who was captured on a raid. And he was taken away from Britain and taken across the water to Ireland. It's not that much of a trip. It's about 32 miles. And so they took him across, and there he was sold to a pagan, to a druid. Now, druids were really remarkable people because their bodies were covered with tattoos. And then they tend to paint themselves blue also. So they were pretty scary looking people. And there, Patrick spent 6 years as a slave, sold into slavery. And so, as a slave, he was assigned to be keeper of a flock of sheep in the mountainous area there that belonged to this particular druid. And during the 6 years where he lived out of doors, up in the mountains, tending the sheep with nothing else to do, and he was already a well-educated lad at 16, he became quite religious, whereas he had not been that religious as a boy. But during those years of being all alone, religion sort of sneaks up on you and you start talking to angels. And he had his own angel who watched out for him, his own guardian angel, you might say. His own guardian angel's name was Victor. Now, Victor would come to him in dreams. And the more time passed, the more religious he became. And finally, Victor said to him after 6 years, Patrick, you've been here long enough. Leave now and go to the shore. There will be a ship waiting. And in fact, there was. Patrick abandoned his flock and fled. 3 days he went through the whole rugged, mountainous, stony area, and he finally made it to the shore. I'm sure that druid had people chasing him, but he probably didn't know, or he would have had, but he probably didn't know because they had very little contact except twice a year when they would bring the sheep back down. And he found, in fact, that ship at the shore, and after some negotiations and another 3 days of going back and forth, they finally relented and offered to take him because they were leaving for Britain. And they took him along, and he was home. Once he was home, he learned that his parents had died from a plague. They had both died. But he was, as a result, a very wealthy young man in his 20s. Very wealthy. And he had received an excellent education, having not been kidnapped and made a slave until he was 16. And he had acquired such a high level of religious belief by the time he got there. I mean, when you're having conversations with Victor, you've become pretty religious. And so he followed his uncle's advice, and he became a priest. Well, he went to school to be a priest. And he was finally ordained, and he studied in France, he studied in Egypt. And finally he came back to Britain. And Victor came to him again. Patrick, it's time to be going back to Ireland. Ireland? I was a slave in Ireland. But it happened. Again, he went. This time with an older priest and a retinue of followers, and they went to Ireland. Now, the priest the bishop actually, that he was sort of apprenticed to, died not long after they reached Ireland. And so at that point, Patrick assumed the duties and became the leader of the missionary group. And he toured around Ireland.
Kiss on the cheek,
And
please.
during his lifetime, he opened 3,000 churches for the church.
Thank you.
Converted thousands, hundreds of thousands from their Druid beliefs to the church. And he lived on. Now, St. Patrick's Day, we don't celebrate his birthday. Instead, St. Patrick's Day is on the date of St. Patrick's death, not his birthday. Because we're not too bloody sure when his birthday was. But we do know when he died. And he did write his memoirs before he died, and he kept a diary all of his life. And so there's a lot written about St. Patrick that we know because it was in his own hand that it was brought down. And there are things that you should remember about St. Patrick. One, never say St. Patty. It's St. Patty. St. Pat. Because St. Patty with a D is feminine. Now everyone goes out, and I'm sure you all know that on St. Patrick's Day, people do tend to drink a wee bit of whiskey or beer. And while you're out there having a touch of this or that, they'll be telling you, have a good Irish drink, have a Killings, Irish red beer. Yeah, it's made by Coors in Denver. Ah, the things we all put up with. Now, and St. Patrick's parades, we all know about St. Patrick's parades, right? Oh, a tradition from old Ireland, right? All the Irishmen brought it here from Ireland, right? No, the first St. Patrick's Day was in Boston. The first parade was in Boston. The second one was in New York. So St. Patrick's Day is an American tradition because St. Patrick's Day in Ireland was and still basically remains, although it's been terribly influenced by the Americans, but it was and it still remains a religious holiday. And as I leave, I'm telling you the last thing you do if you're a good Irishman on St. Patrick's Day and you're in Dublin. If you're in Dublin, there's an old tradition. See, in the morning you go to Mass, and from there, you probably have dinner with your family, and from there, you go straight to the pub. And you're drinking probably Guinness all the night. And when the pub closes, traditionally it used to close at 10 o'clock, never later. But it would close at 10 o'clock. And the last tradition of St. Patrick's Day was you drown the shamrock. The shamrock, clover, a three-leaf clover, that's the symbol of the Trinity. So it was an important religious element for the Druids. St. Patrick stole it from the Druids because it was useful to represent the Trinity. So you take a shamrock from out of your hat band on St. Patrick's Day. You toss it into a large glass of ale. That's called drowning the shamrock. And you drink it down at last call. And that's how you close out St. Patty's Day in Dublin. And we'll bring up Wanda Stewart.